Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We're going to be looking at the Russia-Ukraine situation today. Things are getting a little tense after those reports about U.S. missiles being used in the conflict.
Yeah.
We've got three sources to help us break this all down. We've got a CNBC report, which has a pretty good overview of kind of what's been going on recently, an on-the-ground perspective from AP News, and then a piece from Tagesschau, which is a German news outlet. That gives us, I think, a little bit of a different take on things. So buckle up. We're going to go beyond the headlines here and try to figure out what this all means, particularly in light of Russia's updated nuclear doctrine.
You're right. That doctrine update has definitely sent ripples through the international community. It's a significant development that warrants, I think, a closer look.
Absolutely. Okay, let's start with this. CNBC is reporting that Ukraine might have used U.S.-made ATACMS missiles to hit a target inside Russia for the first time. They were supposedly targeting a military facility near the city of Karachev in the Bryansk region, right on the border with Ukraine.
Yes, but the details surrounding the attack are a bit murky, as is often the case in active conflict zones. Russia claims they intercepted most of the missiles, minimizing the damage and saying that there were no casualties. Ukraine, though, is playing it close to the vest. They haven't officially confirmed using ATACMS, but they have stated that they have the capability to strike deep inside Russian territory. They're making sure everyone knows they have both U.S.-supplied missiles and domestically produced long-range drones at their disposal.
So it sounds like classic wartime misinformation, trying to keep the enemy guessing. But for those of us who aren't military strategists, can you break down what makes these ATACMS missiles so special?
Sure thing. ATACMS stands for Army Tactical Missile System. They're long-range surface-to-surface ballistic missiles with a range of up to 300 kilometers. Which is about 186 miles. They pack quite a punch.
Okay, 186 miles. That's a serious distance. And this is where it gets even more interesting, right? Because the Biden administration actually eased restrictions on Ukraine using these missiles inside Russia. That wasn't always the case. And it's a decision that's drawn quite a bit of criticism, even from incoming President Trump.
You're absolutely right that policy shift is a big deal. It signals a potential escalation in U.S. involvement in the conflict, and it's definitely something that Trump will have to deal with when he takes office.
I'm curious, what do you think prompted the Biden administration to make such a controversial decision?
It's difficult to say for sure, but it could be a sign that the U.S. is losing faith in Ukraine's ability to push back Russian forces on their own. Or it could be a way of trying to force Russia to the negotiating table by raising the stake.
Either way, it's a high-risk gamble. And then you have the location of this attack in Bryansk, like Karachev. It's only about 20 kilometers from the border, which means it could have potentially been within range of the HIMARS systems that Ukraine was already allowed to use.
That's a great observation. HIMARS, or the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, has been a real game changer for Ukraine, allowing them to hit targets with precision at a longer range than they could before. So why choose a target that was already potentially within reach?
Exactly. It makes you wonder if there was a symbolic element to choosing this target. Was it a way of sending a message to Russia, saying we can hit you anywhere, anytime?
Possibly. It's also worth noting that Karachev is located quite close to a major highway and railway line that Russia uses to supply its troops in Ukraine. So while there may be a symbolic element, there's also a definite strategic logic to hitting this particular location. It could be an attempt to disrupt those supply lines and put further pressure on Russian forces.
Right. So it's not just about symbolism. It's about hindering Russia's ability to wage war effectively. And it's worth mentioning that there have also been reports of a Ukrainian offensive in the nearby Kursk region. All of this points to a potential escalation of the conflict.
Absolutely. And speaking of escalation, we can't ignore Russia's response to this attack.
You're right. It's been anything but subtle. Foreign Minister Lavrov has openly accused the West of fueling the conflict and trying to provoke Russia. But even more concerning is President Putin's decision to approve an updated nuclear doctrine. This is the part that really has everyone on edge.
It's a development that has definitely raised the specter of nuclear conflict, which was always a possibility in the background, but now feels much more immediate.
So let's talk about this updated doctrine. What exactly does it say, and what does it mean for the potential for a wider war?
Essentially, the update broadens the circumstances under which Russia might consider using nuclear weapons. It states that any attack on Russia, or Belarus, a close ally, by a non-nuclear state that's being supported by a nuclear power will be considered a joint attack. That means it could potentially trigger a nuclear response from Russia. They also specifically list the launching of ballistic missiles against Russia as a condition that could warrant the use of nuclear weapons.
So how does this affect our understanding of the situation? Does it make you more concerned about the potential for nuclear war?
It certainly raises the level of concern. It's a reminder that this conflict has the potential to spiral out of control very quickly. However, it's important to remember that this doctrine is also a form of posturing. Russia is trying to intimidate the West to discourage further support for Ukraine.
So it's a dangerous game of brinkmanship. And unfortunately, all of this is happening against a backdrop of immense human suffering. This conflict is now dragged on for 1,000 days, 1,000 days of violence, displacement, and loss. The AP News article really brought home the human cost of this war.
It's a grim milestone, and it's easy to get lost in the geopolitical maneuvering and forget about the individuals whose lives have been shattered by this conflict. It really underscores the urgency of finding a peaceful resolution. But as we've seen, the path to peace is fraught with obstacles and potential pitfalls.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest unknowns in all of this is the incoming Trump administration. He's made it clear that he wants to end the war quickly. But what does that actually mean in practice, and how will his approach differ from Biden's?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Trump's foreign policy has always been unpredictable, and his stance on Ukraine has been somewhat ambiguous. On the one hand, he's expressed admiration for Putin's strongman leadership style. On the other hand, he's also criticized the invasion and authorized some military aid to Ukraine during his previous presidency, so it's really anyone's guess how he'll approach this situation.
The AP News article mentioned that some Republicans are already criticizing Biden's decision to give Ukraine the green light to use those ATACMS missiles inside Russia. They argue that it ties Trump's hands and limits his options.
Yes, and that speaks to a larger debate within the U.S. about how involved we should be in this conflict. Some argue that we have a moral obligation to support Ukraine in their fight for freedom and democracy. Others worry that continued military aid will only prolong the conflict and increase the risk of a direct confrontation with Russia. Trump will have to navigate these competing perspectives, and his decisions will have a profound impact on the trajectory of the war.
I'm curious, what are some of the specific things we should be watching for from the Trump administration that might give us clues about his strategy?
Well, one key indicator will be the level of military and financial aid that he's willing to provide to Ukraine. Will he maintain or even increase the current level of support, or will he cut back on aid in an attempt to pressure Ukraine into making concessions? Another thing to watch for is his rhetoric towards Putin. Will he continue to condemn the invasion and call for Russia to withdraw, or will he adopt a more conciliatory tone in an effort to de-escalate the situation?
It seems like every decision he makes is going to have huge ramifications, and while we're waiting to see what Trump's next move will be, Russia is continuing to ramp up the pressure. We talked about the updated nuclear doctrine, but there's another development that I found particularly chilling, the mass production of mobile bomb shelters. It feels like something out of a dystopian novel, but it's happening right now.
Yes, those QAM units are a stark reminder of the very real threat of nuclear escalation. They're designed to protect people from a variety of threats, including radiation and chemical attacks, and the fact that Russia is producing them on such a large scale suggests that they're taking the possibility of a nuclear conflict very seriously.
It's unsettling, to say the least. On the one hand, they're saying they don't want a nuclear war, but on the other hand, they're building these bomb shelters and issuing ominous warnings about the consequences of supporting Ukraine. It's hard to know what to make of it all.
It's a classic case of mixed messages. Russia is trying to project an image of strength and resolve, but there's also an underlying current of fear. They know that a nuclear war would be catastrophic for everyone involved, but they're also worried about appearing weak or backing down, so they're trying to walk a very fine line, and it's creating a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty.
It's a high-stakes game of chicken, and it's terrifying to think about the potential consequences if someone miscalculates. But in all of this talk about nuclear threats and geopolitical maneuvering, it's easy to lose sight of the human cost of this war. We talked about the 1,000-day mark, but I keep thinking about that detail from the AP News article, the Russian Shahed drone striking a dormitory at an educational facility in Kharkiv.
It's a heartbreaking reminder that war doesn't discriminate. It impacts civilians, children, innocent people who are just trying to live their lives. And as the conflict drags on the toll on Ukraine's people and infrastructure continues to mount, they're facing a humanitarian crisis on top of a military one.
And yet, despite all of this, Ukraine is still standing. They haven't given up. They haven't surrendered. Their resilience in the face of such overwhelming odds is truly remarkable.
It really is, and it's not just a matter of fighting spirit. Ukraine has also demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt and innovate. Remember Zelensky's resilience plan that he presented to Parliament.
Yes, he talked about new approaches to army management, establishing a military ombudsman, and revising the system for military contracts.
Exactly, and what's fascinating about this plan is that it reveals a long-term vision for Ukraine's defense. They're not just focused on winning the current battles, they're thinking about how to build a more resilient and self-sufficient military for the future. And a key part of that strategy is a shift towards domestic production of weapons and equipment.
You're talking about their goal of producing 30,000 long-range drones and 3,000 long-range missiles next year. Right, that seems incredibly ambitious considering the circumstances.
It's a bold goal, no doubt, but it reflects a recognition that they can't rely on Western support forever. They need to develop their own capacity to defend themselves. And this is where that Tagesschau article becomes particularly relevant. It emphasizes how this move towards domestic production represents a fundamental shift in Ukraine's strategic thinking. They're aiming to become less reliant on Western aid and more self-reliant in their defense capabilities.
It's a bold move considering the sheer scale of Russia's military-industrial complex. But I suppose they don't have much choice. They need to find a way to survive, even if Western support dwindles, and those long-range missiles could really change the dynamics of the conflict, couldn't they?
Absolutely. The ability to strike deeper into Russian territory would give them a significant advantage. As Jack Watling, a defense analyst quoted in the AP News article, pointed out, it would force Russia to spread its forces more thinly, making it more difficult to defend all of its fronts. It could also raise the stakes considerably, increasing the risk of escalation and retaliation.
So this domestic production push is about more than just self-sufficiency. It's about potentially changing the course of the war. But of course, Ukraine isn't operating in a vacuum. What's happening on the international stage? How is the rest of the world reacting to this escalating conflict?
That's a great question, and it brings us to another layer of complexity in this already tangled situation, because the war in Ukraine isn't just a regional conflict anymore. It's having ripple effects across the globe, forcing countries to reassess their alliances, their priorities, and their place in the evolving world order.
Yeah, it feels like we're witnessing a real turning point in global affairs. This war is testing the very foundations of the international order, wouldn't you say?
I think that's a very astute observation. It's exposing the cracks in our global systems, both politically and economically. The world is being forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about the balance of power and the limits of diplomacy.
And the Tagesschau piece really drove that point home. It wasn't just reporting on the events themselves, it was analyzing how this conflict is reshaping the geopolitical landscape.
Precisely. For example, we're seeing a distinct shift in the dynamics of global alliances. NATO has shown a united front in supporting Ukraine, providing military aid, imposing sanctions on Russia, and bolstering their own defenses. But that unity is being tested. There are growing concerns about the long-term costs of this support. And some countries are starting to question how far they're willing to go.
That reminds me of the Republican criticism we talked about earlier, that those concerns about Biden's decision on the ATACMS missiles, they felt it was tying Trump's hands, potentially dragging the U.S. deeper into the conflict. It seems like even within NATO, there are different levels of commitment.
Yes, and that's where the unpredictable nature of the Trump administration adds another layer of complexity. If he decides to scale back U.S. involvement, it could have a ripple effect throughout the alliance, emboldening Russia and potentially weakening the West's resolve.
So even the most powerful alliance in the world isn't immune to internal pressures and shifting priorities. And what about the countries that haven't taken a firm stance on the conflict? They must be feeling the heat as this situation escalates.
Absolutely. Many countries, particularly in the global south, have tried to maintain a neutral position. They have strong economic ties with Russia, and they're wary of getting drawn into a conflict that they see as primarily a European issue. But as the war drags on and the global implications become more apparent, it's becoming increasingly difficult to stay on the sidelines.
It's like the world is being forced to choose sides.
Yeah.
Even if they'd rather not.
Yeah.
And this conflict is also raising some fundamental questions about the future of warfare itself. We're seeing the increasing use of drones, cyber attacks,
and sophisticated information warfare tactics. It feels like we're getting a glimpse of a very different kind of battlefield.
It's a hybrid war, where traditional military tactics are intertwined with new technologies and unconventional methods, and it's blurring the lines between combatants and civilians, between physical and digital spaces. This raises a whole host of ethical and legal dilemmas that we're only just beginning to grapple with. It's a sobering thought. We're not just talking about tanks and missiles anymore. We're talking about algorithms, disinformation campaigns, and attacks on critical infrastructure. It feels like the rules of engagement are being rewritten in real time.
And that uncertainty is contributing to a sense of unease and anxiety that extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Remember those mobile bomb shelters we talked about? They're not just a practical measure, they're a symbol of the fear and uncertainty that this conflict has unleashed.
It's like a tangible manifestation of our collective anxiety. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. Like we're just tiny players in a grand and chaotic game that we have no control over. So what can we do? How can we as individuals even begin to make sense of this complex and rapidly evolving situation?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed, to resist the temptation to tune out the news or retreat into apathy. We need to understand the complexities of this conflict, the different perspectives involved, and the potential consequences of the choices that are being made. And we need to engage in thoughtful dialogue with each other, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers. We're citizens of a world that is being profoundly shaped by these events. And we have a responsibility to engage with those events, to ask critical questions, and to demand accountability from our leaders.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about recognizing our agency, our ability to influence the course of events, even in small ways. It's about supporting organizations that are working to provide humanitarian aid to those affected by the conflict. It's about speaking out against injustice and demanding a more peaceful and just world.
So in the face of all this complexity and uncertainty, there's still hope. There's still a role for each of us to play in shaping a better future.
Absolutely. And that's perhaps the most important takeaway from our deep dive today. This conflict has exposed the fragility of peace, the interconnectedness of our world, and the urgency of working together to build a more sustainable and equitable future for all.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the specific events in Ukraine to the broader implications for the global order. But as we always say, the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to stay informed, and to engage with the world around you in a thoughtful and critical way. Because ultimately, the future depends on all of us.
I couldn't agree more.
And that's a wrap for today. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper. If you enjoy our daily news podcast and want to stay updated, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell for notifications. Your support really helps us bring you the latest news every day. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.